Hi everyone, I'm the Dark Narrator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling urban legends and folklore out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 5 terrifying legends from the California wilderness. Stories from delivery drivers, maintenance workers, and travelers who ventured into these remote mountain regions and barely made it back to tell the tale. From mysterious figures that appear and vanish without a trace, to abandoned properties with dark histories, and even encounters with something that defies all logical explanation, this collection covers some truly disturbing ground. These are all legends that genuinely unsettled me when I first researched them, and I think they'll stay with you long after the video ends. The second one especially got under my skin. It's about a delivery driver who experienced something in those mountains that still haunts the local folklore to this day. So if you have any theories or know similar legends from your area, feel free to share them in the comments. As always, thank you so much for being here and supporting the channel. It means the world. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's venture into the California mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I was 34 when they assigned me to a location designated as Site 18C, deep in the Sierra foothills, not far from a small settlement called Red Marsh. My occupation back then was straightforward enough, at least in theory. I worked as an inventory auditor for the state's Emergency Logistics Division. By that point in my career, I'd already completed over 100 similar audits. Lots of dust, lots of cross-referencing spreadsheets against physical inventory, and not much else of interest. Most facilities only required inspection twice annually, and typically nothing changed between visits. The work was monotonous, but stable. Every so often, however, an older location would appear in the rotation, one of those Cold War-era bunkers that had been absorbed into the emergency supply network sometime back in the 1990s. Site 18C was exactly that type of facility. It appeared on my schedule the week before Christmas, which was already an ominous sign. I looked at the location and immediately frowned. No convenient highway access, middle of nowhere, and the notes simply stated, "Limited data available, site unmapped." My supervisor offered to increase my per diem and cover hotel expenses, but I figured if I departed early enough, I could complete the audit in a single trip. Honestly, I just wanted it finished so I could move on. The drive wasn't terrible until I passed Emmerline Ridge. That's when the road conditions deteriorated significantly. Ice began coating the pavement, making steering unpredictable. I was driving a rental SUV, which handled reasonably well, but the final stretch was a narrow logging road that clearly hadn't seen a plow in weeks. The trees grew so densely around the road that my phone signal dropped completely. I had to switch over to downloaded offline maps and printed directions from the office. By the time I located the entrance, it was past 1 in the afternoon. The structure was more bunker than building. Poured concrete, half buried into a hillside. No markings, no exterior lights, no windows, just a rusted metal hatch with a keypad and a stamped plate reading 18C. I entered the site access code, and the hatch released with a groan that echoed into the surrounding hillside, like the entire mountain was exhaling. The moment I opened it, a wall of intensely cold air rushed out. Not refrigerator cold, colder than that, like the entire building had been sealed and forgotten for decades. Inside, the lighting was dim. Emergency fixtures along the ceiling emitted a faint reddish glow. The backup power system must have been running autonomously. I could hear it humming somewhere deeper within the structure, a low mechanical drone that never varied in pitch. The air smelled dry and metallic, like old batteries mixed with accumulated dust and something faintly chemical I couldn't identify. Rows of crates were stacked 4 high, arranged in precise grids that stretched back into the shadows. Each crate had a barcode label and category designation. I started scanning them systematically, exactly as I'd done countless times before. Nothing unusual initially. Crates of medical gloves, water storage drums, thermal blankets, standard emergency supplies. I worked through the first 2 rows efficiently, marking items off on my digital tablet. That's when I encountered something anomalous. One crate had a different type of label than all the others. Instead of the standard categories like Hydration Level 2 or Triage Basic, this one read Relocation North Cove. That wasn't any category I'd ever encountered in my years doing this work. The font was slightly different too, as if it had been typed on an entirely different system. I attempted to scan the barcode. The tablet emitted an error tone and displayed Format Not Recognized. I hesitated, then opened the crate's lid. Inside were shoes, dozens of them, worn, scuffed, tossed in haphazardly like someone had swept them off a floor directly into the container. Boots, sneakers, sandals, even a couple of ballet flats. All different sizes, different styles. Some were small, children's sizes. One had what appeared to be dried mud caked into the sole, packed in so thoroughly it looked like it had never been cleaned. None of them had inventory tags. None were paired together. It looked like the contents of a lost and found box, not an emergency supply depot. I closed the crate slowly, photographed the label for my report, and marked it for supervisory review. I moved to the adjacent crate, and immediately that same unsettled feeling returned. This one contained notebooks, handwritten journals, spiral-bound, composition style, some held together with duct tape. A few had names and dates scribbled on the covers in pencil or fading marker. None had barcodes, no state insignia, no digital records in the system. I picked up the one on top. It was already open slightly. I flipped through a few pages. It read like a child's diary. The handwriting was uneven, occasionally switching between print and cursive mid-sentence. The entries described waking up in an I was 34 when they assigned me to a location designated as Site 18C, deep in the Sierra foothills, not far from a small settlement called Red Marsh. My occupation back then was straightforward enough, at least in theory. I worked as an inventory auditor for the state's Emergency Logistics Division. By that point in my career, I'd already completed over 100 similar audits. Lots of dust, lots of cross-referencing spreadsheets against physical inventory, and not much else of interest. Most facilities only required inspection twice annually, and typically nothing changed between visits. The work was monotonous, but stable. Every so often, however, an older location would appear in the rotation, one of those Cold War-era bunkers that had been absorbed into the emergency supply network sometime back in the 1990s. Site 18C was exactly that type of facility. It appeared on my schedule the week before Christmas, which was already an ominous sign. I looked at the location and immediately frowned. No convenient highway access, middle of nowhere, and the notes simply stated, "Limited data available, site unmapped." My supervisor offered to increase my per diem and cover hotel expenses, but I figured if I departed early enough, I could complete the audit in a single trip. Honestly, I just wanted it finished so I could move on. The drive wasn't terrible until I passed Emmerline Ridge. That's when the road conditions deteriorated significantly. Ice began coating the pavement, making steering unpredictable. I was driving a rental SUV, which handled reasonably well, but the final stretch was a narrow logging road that clearly hadn't seen a plow in weeks. The trees grew so densely around the road that my phone signal dropped completely. I had to switch over to downloaded offline maps and printed directions from the office. By the time I located the entrance, it was past 1 in the afternoon. The structure was more bunker than building, poured concrete, half buried into a hillside. No markings, no exterior lights, no windows, just a rusted metal hatch with a keypad and a stamped plate reading 18C. I entered the site access code, and the hatch released with a groan that echoed into the surrounding hillside, like the entire mountain was exhaling. The moment I opened it, a wall of intensely cold air rushed out. Not refrigerator cold, colder than that. like the entire building had been sealed and forgotten for decades. Inside, the lighting was dim. Emergency fixtures along the ceiling emitted a faint reddish glow. The backup power system must have been running autonomously. I could hear it humming somewhere deeper within the structure, a low mechanical drone that never varied in pitch. The air smelled dry and metallic, like old batteries mixed with accumulated dust and something faintly chemical I couldn't identify. Rows of crates were stacked 4 high, arranged in precise grids that stretched back into the shadows. Each crate had a barcode label and category designation. I started scanning them systematically, exactly as I'd done countless times before. Nothing unusual initially. Crates of medical gloves, water storage drums, thermal blankets, standard emergency supplies. I worked through the first 2 rows efficiently, marking items off on my digital tablet. That's when I encountered something anomalous. One crate had a different type of label than all the others. Instead of the standard categories like Hydration Level 2 or Triage Basic, this one read Relocation North Cove. That wasn't any category I'd ever encountered in my years doing this work. The font was slightly different too, as if it had been typed on an entirely different system. I attempted to scan the barcode. The tablet emitted an error tone and displayed Format Not Recognized. I hesitated, then opened the crate's lid. Inside were shoes, dozens of them, worn, scuffed, tossed in haphazardly like someone had swept them off a floor directly into the container. Boots, sneakers, sandals, even a couple of ballet flats, all different sizes, different styles. Some were small, children's sizes. One had what appeared to be dried mud caked into the sole, packed in so thoroughly it looked like it had never been cleaned. None of them had inventory tags. None were paired together. It looked like the contents of a lost and found box, not an emergency supply depot. I closed the crate slowly, photographed the label for my report, and marked it for supervisory review. I moved to the adjacent crate, and immediately that same unsettled feeling returned. This one contained notebooks, handwritten journals, spiral-bound, composition style, some held together with duct tape. A few... I was 34 years old when it happened. The cabin belonged to Nolan, an old friend from my ski patrol days at Mammoth Mountain. We'd spent enough freezing nights together in emergency shelters and avalanche monitoring stations to build genuine trust between us. After his uncle passed away unexpectedly, Nolan inherited this deteriorating property near Coldwater Ridge, located somewhere off a fire road that barely registered on digital maps. He mentioned he was considering renovating it to rent out as a winter retreat and needed help assessing what work would be required. I owed him favors from years back. And honestly, I missed being in real altitude. I hadn't been up in serious mountain terrain for a couple of years, and part of me craved that familiar sting in my lungs again, that particular quality of cold that makes you feel genuinely alive. We drove up separately that Friday. It was early December, right after a moderate storm had swept through the Sierra Nevada range. By the time I arrived, the road was already cushioned with fresh snow. No wind, no clouds overhead, just that eerie, muffled stillness that only happens when everything's blanketed in white. The property looked like something from a cautionary tale, not dramatically horrifying, just exhausted. Weathered boards, slanted porch, a rusted lantern hanging from a single nail, swaying slightly as if someone had just released it moments before. One shutter barely attached, tapping rhythmically against the siding whenever air currents shifted. I didn't observe any other tire tracks in the snow besides our own. No neighboring cabins visible through the trees, no distant lights. Complete isolation. Nolan had already started a fire when I stepped inside. The interior was warmer than I'd anticipated, though the heat had an uneven quality, never quite reaching the corners of rooms, as if the cold was actively defending certain territories. The smoke carried a strange scent, not just wood smoke. There was a sharp herbal edge to it, like burnt sage or something used in cleansing rituals. The walls were cluttered with his uncle's accumulated possessions, weather-beaten books stacked in precarious piles, trail maps marked with red X's in various locations, jars containing labeled rock and soil samples arranged on shelves. The oddest element was a wall covered in Polaroid photographs, dozens of them. Most were simply wilderness shots, trees, rock formations, frozen lakes, but several had these peculiar white dots hovering near the tops of the frames. Not snow, not lens glare, just clean, circular specks, like something floating high above the tree line. I didn't comment on them, just absorbed the details while Nolan opened a couple of beers. We spent that first evening working until darkness fell, patching a section of roof, sealing a draft around the back window, heating canned chili over the fire, and playing cards on a wobbly folding table that threatened to collapse with each hand dealt. At some point after his second beer, Nolan brought up something his uncle used to discuss, local folklore, something called the Cold Ones. He chose his words carefully, as if even speaking about it made him uncomfortable. He said they weren't ghosts exactly, not monsters either, just people, or rather people who used to be people, who disappeared into the forest and returned fundamentally changed, quieter, slower, still human-shaped, but not quite right anymore. His uncle apparently believed the Donner Party didn't simply starve to death. He thought they transformed into something colder, something that now belonged to the woods in a way living humans never could. His uncle apparently believed the Donner Party didn't simply starve to death. He thought they transformed into something colder, something that now belonged to the woods in a way living humans never could. His uncle said the old man kept extensive journals, insisted he'd witnessed figures watching from the tree line, even claimed to hear footsteps circling the cabin at night. He called it the tapping, always occurring just beyond the reach of firelight. We laughed about it, naturally. It felt like folklore passed down through too many isolated winters, stories people tell themselves when loneliness becomes oppressive. But something about the way Nolan spoke suggested he didn't entirely dismiss it as fiction. We went to bed around midnight. I couldn't get comfortable. The mattress sagged too much in the middle, creating pressure points that made my back ache in strange places. I must have dozed off briefly, but suddenly I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling in complete darkness, and something was tapping. Not rapid, not frantic, just a slow, irregular clicking sound, like two pieces of bone or stone being knocked together deliberately. It had a hollow, echoing quality that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. I assumed it was Nolan outside, maybe adjusting the gutter he'd mentioned earlier. But when I checked, his bedroom door was standing open, and his bed was completely empty. I called his name softly. No response. I walked to the front door, still bolted from the inside. His truck sat in exactly the same position as earlier. The snow surrounding it was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks of any kind. My stomach dropped. I stepped out onto the porch wearing nothing but boots and thermal underwear. No gloves, no coat. The air was absolutely motionless. My breath fogged out and hung there like it was reluctant to dissipate. I scanned the tree line, black shapes against gradually lightening gray sky. Dawn was hours away. Then I saw it. About 50, maybe 60 feet out, just beyond the clearing's edge, something stood between two trees. Tall, thin, not hunched, not leaning, just standing with perfect, unnatural stillness. Too still. The kind of stillness that immediately registers as wrong because living things don't remain that motionless. They shift weight, they breathe, they adjust balance unconsciously. It was pale, not white exactly, more like dry ash or bleached wood. The posture was stiff and awkward, with shoulders pulled up high, as if they'd been lifted and never returned to a natural position. I blinked once, maybe twice, and it simply wasn't there anymore. No movement, no fading into shadows, no sound of retreat, just instantly absent. I stood frozen on that porch for a full minute before backing inside and locking the door with trembling hands. I didn't sleep the remainder of that night, just sat in a chair facing the door, listening to every creak and shift the old cabin made. Nolan stumbled back in just after 8 the next morning. He looked terrible, hair matted with sweat or moisture, eyes red-shot and unfocused, breathing short and labored. He said he'd gone out for a walk and gotten disoriented, though he couldn't explain why he'd left or how long he'd been gone. When I pressed him, he just shook his head in confusion. Then he looked directly at me and asked, "Did you hear any tapping last night?" I lied and said no. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to validate what we both feared was true. Later that day, we hiked out behind the cabin to clear some fallen branches blocking a trail. About a quarter-mile in, we discovered something that made both of us stop dead. A perfect circle in the snow, approximately 6 feet in diameter. Inside the circle, the ground was completely bare, just exposed earth, dark and somehow wrong-looking. The snow around it was entirely undisturbed, as if the circle had been cut out with surgical precision. No footprints approached it, no fallen branches inside it, just that clean, impossible boundary. Nolan refused to go near it. He stood several feet back, staring like the air itself had changed properties around that spot. "The cold there feels wrong," he said quietly. "Not colder, just empty, like it's pulling something out of you." I felt it too when I got close, this strange pressure drop, similar to what you feel before a thunderstorm, but inverted. Wrong. We marked the trail with orange surveyor's tape and returned to the cabin well before dusk. Neither of us wanted to be in those woods after dark. That night, I didn't even pretend I'd be able to sleep. I stayed fully dressed, boots positioned near the door, flashlight gripped in my hand. Around 1:30 the next morning, the tapping returned. Only this time, it started directly overhead. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the roof, one careful step at a time. After each footfall came that pause, then that distinctive clicking sound, like 2 pieces of bone or stone being knocked together deliberately. It had a hollow, echoing quality that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. I didn't move, barely breathed, just listened as the pattern continued across the entire length of the roof, end to end, before falling silent again. The next morning, there were no footprints in the snow around the cabin, but 3 long scratches had appeared on the frost-covered window directly where I'd been lying, each of them about a foot long, spaced with perfect precision. They weren't deep gouges, but they were deliberate, intentional, impossible to dismiss as random damage. I asked Nolan directly if he was messing with me, playing some elaborate prank. He just shook his head, eyes wide with genuine fear. Said he'd heard footsteps too, heavy ones circling the cabin repeatedly. Right before dawn, he said he saw the treetops shift and sway, as if something massive had moved through them without ever touching the ground. We didn't discuss it further, just packed up our vehicles, loaded what we'd brought, and prepared to leave. We didn't complete even half the repairs we had originally planned. Before departing, I found something wedged behind a loose board on the porch, a small leather pouch, deliberately hidden. Inside were tiny bones, possibly from a rabbit or squirrel, and a folded Polaroid photograph. The picture showed that same circle in the snow we'd found. I left a short-term contract position at a regional archive office in early December. The job had run its natural course, 6 months of sorting, scanning, and cataloging municipal records that smelled like dust and forgotten decades. Instead of renewing my overpriced lease in Eureka, I decided to accept my uncle's long-standing offer. He owned an old cabin near Langtree Bluff that he'd used occasionally for hunting trips. He'd told me years ago I could use it whenever I needed to disappear for a while. His exact words. The cabin was about as isolated as you could manage without living in a tent. 2 rooms, no internet connection, no neighbors for miles, just a small propane heater, a wood stove, shelves stocked with dried and canned food, and a radio permanently tuned to emergency channels. The people in Langtree had this tradition they referred to as deep season. Essentially, once the first significant snowfall arrived, they'd start sharing stories again. Not just children either, full-grown adults participated. Tales of hikers vanishing without explanation, strange lights floating beyond the ridgelines, tall figures moving silently between pine trees. They even had a specific name for these entities, the Long Ones. According to local lore, they appeared during deep season and vanished when snow melted in spring. Honestly, I assumed it was just regional folklore. Every mountain town maintains its collection of supernatural stories. I'd grown up around that kind of talk. It never seemed particularly threatening, just part of the local culture. My first week there was exactly what I needed. Quiet, cold, peaceful. I'd wake early, drink hot coffee wrapped in a wool blanket, work on some freelance client materials during daylight hours, and read or write in the evenings by lantern light. For the first time in months, I wasn't compulsively checking my phone every few minutes or worrying about approaching deadlines. It felt therapeutic. That changed on the 6th night. I woke around 1 in the morning to a beeping sound, sharp and repetitive. It took me several seconds to identify the source, the carbon monoxide detector, a small plastic unit plugged in near the stove. The red light was blinking urgently. The air inside didn't smell unusual, no gas odor, nothing obviously wrong, but I cracked open the windows and shut off the propane heater as a precaution. Then I wrapped myself in 2 layers of flannel and sat on the couch, watching my breath fog the increasingly cold air. After perhaps 20 minutes, the blinking stopped. I figured maybe the cold was affecting the sensor, or the unit was simply old and malfunctioning. I made a mental note to replace it next time I drove into town. 3 nights later, I was working late, around the same time, approximately 1:15, when it activated again. But this time, the digital screen showed no carbon monoxide reading, no alert level displayed, just a blinking message that read, air. Just that single word, air. Didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. The next morning, I drove down into Langtree and purchased a new detector, a more expensive model with a proper digital screen and multiple sensors. I tested it at the store, watched it cycle through its startup sequence without issues, and plugged it immediately upon returning to the cabin. I placed the old unit on a shelf, trying not to think about it too much. That night, I stayed up late finishing a presentation for a client. Around 1:15, same window of time, the new detector went off, loud and sharp. I flinched so hard I knocked over my coffee mug, sending lukewarm liquid across my paperwork. It was blinking red, identical to the old unit, and again the screen displayed air. No gas levels, no data, just that inexplicable message. That's when it transitioned from feeling broken to feeling wrong. I shut it off, threw on a jacket, and stepped outside into the cold. Snow had been falling gently since early evening. The ground was quiet and still, but what struck me most forcefully was how undisturbed everything appeared. No animal tracks, no trail marks, not even bird impressions. The snow was absolutely flat and pristine around the entire cabin. When I returned inside, something caught my attention. The chair I always used, an old wooden chair tucked under the corner desk, had shifted position. I always sat facing the corner where the desk was pushed against the wall, but now the chair was angled slightly, maybe just a few degrees, pointed toward the window instead. I stood there staring at it for a long moment. I couldn't remember moving it. I wasn't tired enough to forget something that specific, and it was too deliberate to be random or accidental. Still, I nudged it back into position and tried not to dwell on it. I locked the door again, kept the flashlight within easy reach, and attempted to sleep. The next morning, snow had accumulated again, a couple of fresh inches, clean powder covering everything. But this time, there were tracks. One set, heavy boot prints coming from the tree line, approaching the cabin, stopping directly at my window, my bedroom window, then turning around and heading back into the forest. No prints leading to the door, none passing through the clearing, just that single path, there and back. I stared at them for a long time, then photographed them with my phone. Later that day, I drove into town for supplies. I showed the photograph to the woman working at the general store. She barely glanced at it before responding. "Mountain visitors," she said dismissively. "Happens during deep season." You get strange ones up there." She said it with the same casual tone someone might use to describe raccoons in the garbage. That night, I secured the window with the deadbolt. I remember thinking I was probably being paranoid, but I did it anyway. I also positioned a small table in front of the door, not that it would actually stop anyone, but it provided some psychological comfort. I didn't leave the cabin the following day, didn't check the woodshed, didn't even open the blinds. Just stayed near the fire, read an entire book cover to cover, and waited for nightfall. I wasn't exactly frightened, but my awareness was razor sharp, like waiting for something inevitable without knowing what form it would take. Around 8 that evening, the radio turned itself on. It started with static, then feedback, then a voice, male, soft, almost whispering through interference. Too quiet to distinguish most words, but one phrase came through with perfect clarity. My full name, first and last, pronounced correctly. I stared at the radio in disbelief. Then I switched it off and unplugged it completely from the wall. That night, I didn't attempt sleep, just sat in the armchair facing the door, flashlight and a long kitchen knife within reach. My phone sat in my lap the entire time, no signal bars, completely useless, but somehow comforting to hold. The new detector didn't activate, but at some point after 2 in the morning, I noticed the chair again. Turned, just slightly, unmistakably angled back toward the window. I hadn't moved it. I'd been watching the door continuously, but there it was, repositioned. I stood there staring at it for hours, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Then, around 4, the solar-powered emergency lights outside suddenly activated. They'd been non-functional since I'd arrived. My uncle had claimed they were solar-powered, but I'd never seen them work once. No reason they should illuminate on a dark December night. But there they were, flickering on as if someone had deliberately triggered them. I stood up and approached the window cautiously. What I saw outside made my stomach plummet. The clearing around the cabin, which had been empty just hours earlier, was now completely covered in footprints, hundreds of them, not arranged in paths or trails, just a wide, chaotic ring surrounding the entire structure. No tracks in, none leading out, and none of them matched each other. Some were deep, as if from heavy boots, others shallow, like bare feet pressing into soft snow. Some small, some wide, all facing different directions. It looked like a crowd had been walking in circles out there for hours, though I heard nothing. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and left immediately. Didn't pack properly, didn't collect my laptop or most of my belongings, just got in my truck and drove. I didn't regain phone signal until I'd cleared the 3rd ridge. Then suddenly everything returned. Notifications, emails, voicemails, flooding in like nothing unusual had happened. I called the ranger station and reported everything. To their credit, they didn't laugh or dismiss me, said they'd send someone to investigate. 2 days later, I received a voicemail. Calm voice, professional tone. They'd inspected the cabin. Everything was fine. No signs of trespassing, no damage, no footprints, no evidence anyone had been there at all. When I asked about the radio transmission using my name, the ranger explained, "We don't broadcast names on emergency channels, only call signs and numerical codes." That was the extent of their explanation. I moved south after New Year's, got a studio apartment near the city, haven't been back to Langtree Bluff. Don't plan to. My cousin Mara invited a group of us to her grandparents' old cabin near Timberlock for winter break. There were 5 of us total. Me, Mara, her boyfriend Casey, and 2 friends named Taryn and Jules. None of us had particularly exciting holiday plans, and the prospect of spending several days partially drunk in the mountains sounded significantly better than melting into our respective couches at home. We loaded 2 vehicles with whatever groceries and warm clothing we could reasonably fit and departed the day after Christmas. The final hour of the drive felt increasingly like a dare. The road narrowed progressively, ice accumulating on the pavement. No signs indicating anything, just snowbanks and tire grooves from what appeared to be a plow truck that had given up halfway through its route. When we finally arrived, the place looked exhausted. The front door hung slightly crooked, one shutter dangled at an angle. The roof supported this thick crust of accumulated snow that looked dangerously close to causing structural collapse. But somehow, it still felt inviting in that rustic, slightly decrepit way. Inside smelled like pine needles and decades-old dust, the kind of pervasive cold that clings to fabric and skin. We got the portable space heaters running, threw blankets over the ancient couch, and unpacked our food supplies. There was no cell signal whatsoever, and radio reception was minimal at best. That first day passed in a pleasant blur. Card games, cheap boxed wine, lukewarm cocoa, and collective efforts to revive the old television set. It buzzed and whined but produced nothing viewable. Honestly, the lack of connectivity made everything feel more fun, like we genuinely escaped modern life. After dinner, we built a fire and took turns reading disturbing content from saved internet articles. Mara pulled up a story about a floating head entity from Malaysian folklore called a penanggalan. Taryn found a post about lost time phenomena in some remote canyon where people would blink and suddenly find themselves miles from their starting location with no memory of traveling. Then Casey, who always gravitates toward the strangest possible topics, read out a scanned newspaper article from the 1980s about something called snowwalkers around Timberlock. A few locals had reportedly witnessed tall, unusually thin figures walking through storms along the ridgelines, always alone, always at a distance. Not bears, not moose, something else. The article never explicitly stated what they were, just hinted at regional superstition, things people discussed quietly but never claimed directly to have experienced. Mara rolled her eyes and dismissed it as knockoff Bigfoot mythology. We moved on to other topics. That night, wind picked up dramatically. Tree branches slapped against windows hard enough that we had to wedge a book into one window frame to stop the incessant rattling. At some point, Taryn mentioned she thought she'd heard someone pacing behind the cabin, slow, measured footsteps crunching through snow. We brushed it off. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, the kind of thing you absolutely don't want to investigate while wearing only socks. The next morning, Jules went outside to dispose of fireplace ash and just stood there, motionless, holding the door half open. We all gathered to see what had captured her attention. Footprints. Not boot prints, not identifiable animal tracks, just long, deep impressions in the snow, clean heel-to-toe patterns leading right up to our back door, then curving off into the woods. No drag marks, no signs of someone doubling back, like someone had walked barefoot through snow that was, without exaggeration, at least 6 inches deep. We stood there silently for a while, nobody quite willing to voice what we were all thinking. Then Casey grabbed his trekking pole and started taking measurements. "These are almost 6 feet apart," he said, crouching near the steps. "That's not a normal human stride, not barefoot, not in this depth of snow." We threw out theories, even ridiculous ones. Maybe melting and refreezing snow had distorted someone's actual tracks. Maybe it was an elaborate prank by local kids. But Jules spoke up quietly and said she'd woken around 3 in the morning and heard something breathing outside her wall. Not wind, not the structure settling, breathing. That evening, we double-checked every window and locked all the doors, even shoved a chair under the front door handle. The atmosphere felt heavier than the previous night, like static electricity building without any storm arriving. By 11, the power cut out. Not just lights, everything. Even our phones died simultaneously, which shouldn't have been possible. We lit candles and tried to laugh it off nervously. Casey attempted to troubleshoot the fuse box. Mara grabbed flashlight and went to assist him. When she returned, she was eerily quiet. Didn't say much, just sat down very close to the fire and kept glancing toward the door. After midnight, the tapping started. Not banging, not scratching, just soft, steady, rhythmic tapping on the attic window, the high window right under the A-frame roof peak. That window was completely inaccessible from ground level. No ladder, no overhang to climb, nothing. Casey grabbed the crowbar and walked outside, walking a complete perimeter around the cabin. We stood clustered by the door, waiting anxiously to hear him yell or find something. He came back 5 minutes later, face drained of color. "Nobody's out there," he said quietly. But the prints had returned, a fresh set, same spacing, same direction, no other tracks anywhere nearby. And every single window had fogged from the inside, as if something had been pressing against the glass, breathing on it. We all moved into the living room with the candles and stayed there together. Nobody wanted to be alone. Finally, Mara told us what she'd seen earlier while checking the fuse box. She said she'd glimpsed something moving behind the trees, a pale, tall, thin shape. Just one. It hadn't made noise, hadn't run, just moved smoothly between trees in a way that didn't look quite right. Taryn started crying. We decided unanimously that nobody was going to sleep. Around 3 in the morning, the fire popped so violently it sounded like breaking glass. Smoke began billowing into the room. The chimney must have become blocked somehow. We opened the back door to ventilate the space. That's when Jules screamed. There was something standing just beyond the tree line. Not close, maybe 50 feet distant, but not hiding either. Tall, but the proportions were fundamentally wrong. Arms too long, hips too narrow, legs bent backward like joints designed for a different type of movement, like it wasn't meant to be upright at all. When it stepped forward, it made no sound, not even the crunch of snow compressing under weight, just this soft hiss, like dry snow being displaced without any actual pressure. Casey slammed the door shut and we shoved the couch in front of it. Nobody argued. Nobody suggested investigating further. We didn't speak for a long time after that, just sat there in flickering candlelight, staring at the floor and listening to our own breathing. By morning, we were already packed. Didn't bother cleaning up, didn't eat breakfast, just loaded both vehicles and drove down the mountain, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. We never mentioned it to Mara's grandparents, never went back. That cabin is probably still standing up there, windows dark, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Some places should stay empty. I'd accepted a freelance contract that allowed me to work remotely, and rather than continuing to hemorrhage money on rent in Sacramento, I decided to take advantage of another uncle's offer. He had a seasonal property near Highland Falls that he rarely used anymore. The cabin was primitive by modern standards. No Wi-Fi, minimal cell reception, just a propane heater that worked intermittently, a wood-burning stove, and enough canned goods to survive several weeks if necessary. The nearest town, if you could call it that, was about 40 minutes down a winding mountain road. Just a gas station, a small grocery store, and a post office that seemed to operate on whatever schedule the elderly postmaster felt like maintaining. I'd planned to stay through January, maybe into February, get some work done, clear my head, disconnect from everything for a while. The first week was productive. Quiet mornings, cold but manageable. A comfortable rhythm developed. Work during daylight, read in the evenings, early to bed. Then, on the 8th night, something changed. I was working late, probably close to 1 in the morning when I heard my phone buzz. Odd, because I rarely got signal up there, and I certainly wasn't expecting messages at that hour. I glanced at the screen. Text message from an unknown number. No area code I recognized. It read, "Still awake?" I stared at it for a moment, assuming it was a wrong number. Didn't respond, just set the phone back down and continued working. 5 minutes later, another message from the same number. "I know you're awake." That one made me uncomfortable. I checked the number again, tried to call it back. The call wouldn't connect, just went to immediate silence. No ringing, no voicemail prompt. I turned my phone off completely and tried to focus on work. Around 2:30, I heard tapping on the window. Soft, rhythmic. Not wind, not branches, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to investigate. Walked the entire perimeter of the cabin. Nothing. No tracks in the snow, no broken branches, no signs of disturbance. When I came back inside and turned my phone back on, there were 3 more messages. "Why did you go outside? You should stay inside. It's safer inside." My hands started shaking. I checked the signal bars, only one fluctuating, barely enough to receive messages apparently, but not enough to make calls. I tried texting back, "Who is this?" The response came within seconds, "Someone who's been here longer than you." I didn't sleep that night, just sat in the chair facing the door, phone in my lap, flashlight within reach. The next morning, I drove down to the gas station and asked if anyone else had been experiencing weird messages or signal issues. The attendant, an older man who looked like he'd been working there since the station was built, just shrugged. "Happens sometimes up in the mountains," he said vaguely. "Signals get weird, cross connections. Wouldn't worry about it." But I was worried. That night, I left my phone turned off and locked every window, wedged a chair under the door handle, built a fire and kept it burning high. Around midnight, the cabin's landline rang. I didn't even know it was functional, hadn't seen or heard it work since I'd arrived, but there it was, ringing loudly in the kitchen. I stared at it for several rings before finally answering. Static, then breathing, then, very quietly, my own voice. Still awake? I slammed the phone down and backed away from it. It rang immediately. I didn't answer. It kept ringing on and off for the next 3 hours. I sat there listening to it, paralyzed, unable to make myself disconnected or leave the cabin in the middle of the night. Finally, around 3 in the morning, the ringing stopped. I approached the phone cautiously and lifted the receiver. Dial tone. Normal, functional dial tone. I tried calling my own cell phone just to test if the line actually worked. It did. Everything seemed normal. The next day, I packed everything I owned into my car. Didn't leave a note, didn't call my uncle to explain, just loaded up and drove straight back to Sacramento without stopping. My phone buzzed once during the drive, about an hour from the cabin. One final message from that same unknown number. Drive safely. I blocked the number immediately, changed my phone number the following week, never went back to that cabin. My uncle asked me a month later why I'd left so suddenly. I told him I'd gotten a job offer that required me to be back in the city. He seemed to accept that explanation. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, my phone will buzz with notifications, emails, app updates, whatever. And for just a split second, before I look at the screen, I'm terrified it's going to be another message saying, "Still awake?" It never is, but I check every time.